I am in cancer research, but primarily also I'm here to speak today as I'm also a cancer survivor. So I've seen it kind of from both sides of the story. And so I'm here to talk a little bit more about bridging that gap. And so kind of to start off, what do you think about when you hear the words 1 in a million? Well, personally, I think of an idea so revolutionary that it could practically change the world, or something that really doesn't happen quite often. Well, for me, it was being diagnosed with synovial sarcoma. I was 13 when I was initially diagnosed, which I guess kind of begs the question, what do you even think about when you're first diagnosed with cancer? Well, I came up with nothing. And my friends would tell you that's pretty much impossible because my mind runs 100 miles a minute. I'm a human ping pong ball. But at 13, of all the things you're worried about, cancer tends not to be one of them. That happened to other people. That was other people's stories. And it wasn't mine. But I was one of those other people. And it did become part of my story. That being said, I do like to make the distinction. It is not my entire story. But I can't tell you my whole life story in the context of 10 minutes. So I'm going to keep it to this one. So I started out by having my tumor removed. However, unfortunately, when it was actually taken out, they had to cut part of the femoral nerve. And so that made it so that I have no function of my left quad and also no sensory function, which may not seem like a really big deal, but for me, it was because I had been previously a really highly competitive Irish dancer, and dance is pretty much out of the question when you can barely walk. Up to that point, dance had pretty much been my everything. I did it a couple hours every day. It was what I did kind of every time I wasn't doing homework. And so for me, this was something I kind of needed the most when I was already so isolated from school and my peers. Also, it was really tough because for the longest time, they thought it would actually repair itself. But unfortunately, when nerves are fully severed, they do not grow back. And so having false hope in a time where so much of what you're holding on to is hope can be a bit dangerous. That being said, since that, I've relearned how to walk and I've had years of physiotherapy and even a nerve transfer surgery. And from that, I've actually can now walk without a limp. I don't really spontaneously fall down anymore, which is kind of a benefit. And I can even do a little bit of a jig, but it's not very good. And really, I think the most important thing is I can jog if I'm late for the bus, because sometimes those 8:30 a.m. classes can be really tough. After that initial surgery, I did have a lung surgery to look for metastases, and then I actually started into my chemo and radiation. And for any of the other cancer survivors out there, I think they'd agree with me that I'd love to say it's rainbows and butterflies, but it can be pretty brutal at points, especially depending on your side effects. For me, I had the worst nausea I've ever imagined. I couldn't even watch TV because the motion on the screen would just set me off. But really, the hardest part of it wasn't so much the treatment itself, but it was coming to terms with so many of the other side effects that happens when you're sick. So for me, I was terrified, and it was hard for me to come to the terms with that I was terrified of death. And even now, I like to say I'm not a person that is afraid of death, but just like they say in Game of Thrones, for any fans out there, I say not today because there's so much I want to see and experience that I just really want to be a part of. It was also hard seeing kind of the effects the disease had on all the people around me. It was hard on my family, my friends, and trying to protect everyone around me was also kind of one of the things of trying to figure out that balance. And then it's also all the people you meet during your time and seeing also the devastation of some of those friends that you've made pass away because you see the potential that they had to make such a positive impact on the world. And it also reminds you how little control we actually have over our own lives because it could have just as easily been me because cancer is not a disease that discriminates. It affects every gender, age, race, and religion. But really, it was seeing those children that were much younger than me on the cancer ward that were going through the same, if not worse, treatments than me, and having that injustice of kids having cancer before they were even born or before they could say their first words that drove me into research. I've always been a bit of a science nerd. Okay, maybe a big science nerd. I think I asked for like a geology and rock polisher kit when I was 8 because I was thinking I was going to go into geophysics. So I definitely was a bit of a nerd before it, but this was really the push that pushed me into research. And I did work primarily on pediatric cancers. So I saw in the chat earlier that there were some questions about kind of the differences between pediatric cancers and adults. And a lot of people actually don't realize that pediatric cancers are very different from their adult counterparts. And often there are some pediatric cancers that you don't even tend to see in adults. So there is some quite large differences there. So I started out by working on a tumor called atypical teratoid rhabdoid tumor, and it's a brain tumor that mostly affects children under the age of 5. I then ended up switching onto a project on neuroblastoma, which is kind of affects a wider range of kids, but it also is one of the still most difficult to treat, especially regarding relapse, and it has very toxic treatments. And so that was kind of where my main research revolved around. And what I was looking at is cancer cells, and cells, just like kind of us, grow up. So they start as a really unspecialized cell. So all the cells are the same. They're called stem cells. And then over time, they grow up over cell divisions and they form like these adult cells. And so they're highly specialized. So that's where you see your muscle cells and your nerve cells and your lung cells. And so they're very specialized. And so the ones I was looking at were these nerve cells. And just like adults, once you grow up, you kind of stop growing. The issue with neuroblastoma cells is they're not these adult cells. They're stuck somewhere in the middle. I like to call them the difficult teenagers because they're at optimal growth and they don't want to grow up. And so that actually allows them to be very difficult to treat. And what's actually been shown is if you can force these cells to grow up, they often are actually much easier to treat because they actually start showing less signs of these cancer cells and more acting like non-cancerous cells. So they have less growth and less metastases. So I wanted to force these cells to grow up. So I started trying to figure out how could I force these cells to grow up. And what I kind of discovered through my research was that often when all of your cells have the same DNA, to become those muscles and those nerve cells and those lung cells, they have to turn different genes on and off because a nerve cell doesn't need the genes that you need to make a lung cell, and the lung cell doesn't need the nerve cells on. So they turn off the ones they don't need and they turn on the ones they need. And in these cancer cells, there was one kind of protein that silences over 200 genes in these cancer cells. And so I was like, well, what if we turn those genes back on? So I used a drug that would knock out that protein and stop it so that then these genes could be turned back on. And I actually did see those cells grow up. So I was like, okay, great. And then I kind of got thinking a little bit farther. Okay, well, what else can I do? And so I thought a little bit further down that line, and I know Matthew mentioned that central dogma. And so kind of for those genes to be doing their work, they're made into those proteins. And so I was like, okay, what if they have the genes turned on that they need to differentiate, but the proteins aren't doing the job? So just like when you need to do a certain job, you kind of have to do it in the right location. So if I was to tell you, you need to bake a cake, you'd probably go to your kitchen. But what if I was like, nope, you can't be in your kitchen, you have to be in your bathroom? You'd have a pretty hard time baking a cake. So kind of that's the same thing that happens with these proteins is in cancer cells, the proteins I was looking at often need to be in the nucleus. However, in these cancer cells, they get exported out into the cytoplasm of the cell where they can't function. And so I ended up inhibiting that transport so that these proteins can start accumulating back into that nucleus and they're not getting put back into the bathroom and not able to do their job. And then I also saw that differentiation occur. And so that was kind of the more exciting results of my studies and my findings. And it actually allowed me to take my project to both the National Science Fair and then into the International Science Fair in Europe. And I got to discuss with researchers that are leaders in their field, like those that you're speaking to today, and also be surrounded by like-minded youth, which has really furthered my interest in science. And even though I may not always continue to stay in the cancer field with my research, because I do find it is sometimes hard with my previous background, I do know that the research will be in good hands because researchers like the ones you're hearing from today are dedicated to finding these new methods for quicker diagnosis, more effective treatment, and in the end, eliminating cancer altogether. Personally, I finished my cancer treatment back in January 2015, and I'm now cancer-free, and I have been for the last 5 and now almost 6 years, which it already seems in some ways like a lifetime ago, because life looks pretty different now. From that past research, I was welcomed with open arms into the science fair and research community, which has been so welcoming and supportive. I've also become highly involved in the para-athlete community as I joined para-Nordic skiing and rowing, and I'm constantly inspired by my fellow athletes' determination to eliminate the barriers they face and what I've learned is a lot of times we build up these walls of what we can and can't do based off of what is traditionally done. However, if you put in the work and you're willing to do something a bit differently, you can do the same things, if not better. It might just be a bit harder. And being a student that did research at a very young age, I obviously didn't realize always all the limitations in research. And in some ways, I think that enabled me to kind of do things a little bit differently than what would have normally been thought. So there is sometimes benefits there too. I would love to say that, cancer ended on January 8th when I had my last treatment, but unfortunately, that's not how it works. Long-term side effects are always a concern. With more patients surviving kind of now more than ever, we're just starting to realize the implications of many of these chemotherapies and treatments on long-term health. I've been fortunate to not receive a lot of the ones of large concern. That being said, I've got some strange ones that weren't even on the list. I have random anaphylaxis from anything to changes in temperature, to changes in stress, or even food. So I like to say, as a student, I'm allergic to the stress of exams. That being said, it did not get me out of my midterm yesterday. So there isn't always benefits there. That being said, there's also always that fear of relapse disease. That being said, it's kind of the same thing as I choose not to be caught up in these things that may not result in anything. And I want to live my life as much as possible as I can and surround myself with people that are full of life and aren't afraid to push me to take my own healthy risks and find new passions that I fall in love with, like I did for dance. And also, in the end of the day, realizing it's okay when life throws you a curveball just to take an alternative route. I'm also highly grateful for the people and organizations that not only contributed to helping me through treatment, but putting me together back afterwards. 5 years ago, I would have never imagined that I would be here speaking so freely about my story. But really, at the end of the day, what I've learned through all of this is take the time to hear people's stories, because there are some pretty interesting ones out there if you take the time to listen. And I mean every kind of story, not just the cancer ones, because there is hardship and resiliency everywhere. That being said, I am constantly inspired by my fellow survivors and patients. And so I would like to end off with a quote that I think really describes the people that I've met along this pathway. And it includes the dedicated researchers and oncologists who will change how this disease is being treated and take the burden on of losing patients. And the patients and survivors themselves, along with the families that show great humility towards the challenges they've overcome and the hardships. And also for people like you that have put your own kind of stories and difficulties aside and your own differences aside and have chosen to come together for this disease that tends to affect all of us in some way or another. So here's the quote itself. The most beautiful people we have known are those who have known defeat, known suffering, known struggle, known loss, and have found their ways out of the depths. These persons have an appreciation, a sensitivity, and an understanding of life that fills them with compassion, gentleness, and a deep, loving concern. Beautiful people do not just happen. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And yeah, I like to think there's some pretty beautiful people out there. Thank you.